Good evening, everyone. My name's Father Niall Leahy, the new director of Jesuit Centre for Faith and Justice, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to an introduction to Dilexi Te, this webinar on Pope Leo XIV's first apostolic exhortation to all Christians on love of the poor. We have three speakers for you this evening. First of all, Dr. Kevin Hargaden, a social theologian here at JCFJ, James Mellet, from the Church Outreach Officer at Troicres, and our own Peter McVery, social and housing campaigner. Each speaker will speak for 5 minutes, and then and that'll be followed by 10 or 15 minutes of Q&A, and we'll wrap this up by 7:30. So as you're listening to the speakers, please feel free to input your questions into the chat. And then when it comes to the Q&A, I will put the questions to your speakers. And please feel free to indicate if there's any speaker you would like to address in particular. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Kevin Hargaden, JCFJ's social theologian. And Kevin is going to speak to us about Dilexi Te, just giving an overview and a sense of the document as a whole. So, Kevin, over to you.
Thanks very much, Niall. Am I coming through okay?
Yes.
Yeah. And thank you very much to everybody who's come out this evening or logged in. So what I'm going to do is give a kind of brief overview of the document itself and kind of make an argument that it's an excellent document that's worthy of people's ongoing attention. So if we move on one slide there, Sharif, just one more. This is basically what I would identify as the purpose of the document. It's to call the whole church to rediscover that love for the poor that's at the heart of Christian holiness. So this concern for the poor is not a peripheral concern. It's not an optional social commitment. So in paragraph 5, we find love for the Lord then is one with love for the poor. And I read that as the thesis statement for this document. As you all know, Dilexi Te is Leo XIV's first official publication. It's an apostolic exhortation. That's a mode of teaching that carries a great deal of authority. It's a magisterial mode of teaching, but it's a document where a pope is able to direct the attitudes and actions of the faithful on a particular topic in the light of specific circumstances. So it's not like a papal encyclical, it's not like an apostolic constitution, it's like kind of fixed in stone forever. An apostolic exhortation is more like a response at a particular time with a particular problem. So this is the problem of the continuing and persistent reality of inequality, economic inequality in our world. The title, Dilexi Te, is a reference to Revelation chapter 3, verse 9, where Jesus, as the Pope puts it, speaks the words, "I have loved you," to a community that had no influence or resources and was treated instead with violence and contempt. That's how this document opens, and I think that that's really important. He's talking to a church that is not at the center of the world, a church that doesn't have the ear of power. He's talking to the church of the majority world. He's talking to the persecuted church. And Niall and I have talked about this before, that this document is a sequel. Francis began this document as a follow-up to what turned out to be his last official document, which is Dilexit Nos, which was an exhortation about the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And Leo has gladly picked up that unfinished text and made it his own. And it really cannot be overstated how important it is to read these two documents together. So it's basically like a theological sequel. You can think about Godfather 2, but there's more footnotes and less Marlon Brando. So it shows us that Leo is self-consciously positioning himself as someone who's continuing Francis's work. And it boldly makes the claim that rather than being a question of private, individualized spirituality, the cultivation of a rich devotional life is actually intrinsic to the life dedicated towards justice. So what Francis was trying to do and what Leo has completed is this idea that prayer leads to striving for justice, which I think pushes back against impulses that are present on both what we might call the left and the right of the church. So basically our revolutionary efforts to make real the love God has for the poor rest on the spiritual practices that daily immerse us in the truth that the Lord has and continues to love us. right? So in terms of its overall structure, the document is a remarkably concise account of the vast commitment that the church has had towards poverty and those who are poor over 2 millennia. So there's an introductory chapter where Leo kind of clears the ground, and then he runs chronologically through the biblical preoccupation with poverty in chapter 2. It's a brilliant chapter that really centers its attention on Jesus as the example of poverty. And then in chapter 3, we look at the early church's dedication to the topic. And that's perhaps for me the richest chapter. It's like a compendium of brilliant perspectives from the church fathers and mothers. And then in chapter 4, there's the emergence of the Catholic social tradition and the influence of liberation theology. And then the last chapter seeks to press the contemporary challenge on us, which is the inescapable challenge for today. That last chapter is kind of like the now it's your turn moment, the bit where the Pope stops explaining and he turns to us. So, if Charisse, you move on to the next slide, I want to identify 3 core themes. The first is that the preferential option for the poor is not optional. In Jesus, who was born in a manger and crucified outside the city, the divine choice for the poor is revealed as the pattern of salvation itself. His poverty exposes the false wealth of the world. And in a wonderful paragraph, paragraph 38, Pope Leo remembers Brother Lawrence, who was the treasurer of the church in Rome, and he famously declared that the poor are the treasures of the church. The second then is what I've already touched on, justice and spirituality are intrinsically linked. Reading Dilexti Te without dilexic nous is an invitation to misunderstanding. It's like reading the Two Towers without reading the Fellowship of the Ring. You'll be invited into a bunch of great battles, but you'll really have no idea why it is you're fighting. Throughout the text, we find challenging words of internal critique for the church. And Leo is very clever about this. He very explicitly critiques what we might call the church's right wing, who try to pass justice off as a secondary concern. But he also, in a very clever way, critiques the progressive wing of the church that maybe wants to fight for the kingdom without necessarily paying homage to the king. And this is seen in a really, I'm getting a bit too inside baseball here in terms of well, baseball is his favorite sport, but a bit too technical in the theological detail. But in paragraph 98, he finishes his argument about the relevance of liberation theology by quoting from the document that Pope John Paul II published in 1984 that was seen at the time as the document that kind of shut down liberation theology. So when you really think about it, it's like the perfect rejuvenation of Gustavo Gutierrez and that whole tradition has occurred in this document, where Leo has shown us how to even reread Pope John Paul II's opposition or hostility or skepticism, somewhere on that spectrum, towards liberation theology as a part of how the church has received that tradition. And then finally, this document shows us the continuity of our witness. In this document, Leo clearly wants to signal that he stands over the sometimes controversial papacy of Francis. There's a new pope, but it's the same message. But we also have this amazing treasure trove of how the church has responded to the question of social injustice down through the centuries. From the scriptures through the fathers and mothers of the church to the dozens of different movements that are name-checked. Notably, the Jesuits are not name-checked. The Dominicans get name-checked, the Salesians, all kinds of orders get name-checked, but the Jesuits are left out. But we have a clear signal here that the church must be with the poor. And this is always a Christological claim. So let me finish by saying there are 4 reasons why this document is useful. First of all, it is not a document about social policy, but it's a summons to conversion. So in the work of the Jesuit Centre for Faith and Justice, for example, we're very dedicated to influencing government policy. But this reminds us that the credibility of our Christian faith actually depends not on whether we can talk about the poor, but whether we actually love people who are experiencing poverty. And then secondly, in an age marked by inequality, by ecological crisis, and by spiritual fatigue, Leo XIV reminds us that the future of the church lies with those that the world forgets. Thirdly, then, to ignore the poor is to misunderstand Christ, and to stand with them is to stand where he stands. And then finally, what I'd want to suggest to you is that Dilexi Te reframes love for the poor as the place where our theology becomes flesh, where contemplation becomes justice, and where worship becomes mercy. So that's my theological overview of this document.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and I appreciated the Lord of the Rings references and baseball sporting references as well. Thanks for that, Kevin, for giving that great overview, and I think that will help people to get into the reading of the document themselves. We'll keep moving, and I'm delighted to welcome Jane Mellet to our webinar. Jane is the Church Outreach Officer for Troicres, which is the overseas development agency for the Catholic Church in Ireland. So Jane is going to speak to Dilexi Te from that perspective she has from Troicres. So Jane, you're most welcome, and I give the floor to you.
Great. Thanks, Niall, and thanks, Kevin, for that mighty summary. I also appreciate the Lord of the Rings references, especially when dealing with heavy material like this. But yeah, just good evening, everyone. Delighted to offer a few reflections on Pope Leo's first and latest encyclical, Dilexi Te. So I suppose my first reaction to reading it was, you know, maybe a little bit cynical. I was thinking, seriously, do we need a reminder of this? Surely it's obvious that to be Catholic, to be Christian in the world today is to embrace the preferential option of the poor. And but obviously it doesn't, you don't have to go too far in our own country even and around the church to see that many people, including those who profess to be Christians, have forgotten this radical element of the gospel and use the word radical in its original sense, that like at the root and the heart of the gospel, like to return to the heart of the gospel is to embrace this message, and to embrace the example of Jesus' life and ministry to us. So it's a document worth spending time with, and the more I got into it and moved through it, there was just lovely reminders um, at what the gospel message is really about in this sense. So um, and there was also hints in it for me where Pope Leo is acknowledging that like there can be a ridicule of justice works even in our church at this time. So he's really trying to urge us all to go back and read our gospels again, and to remind us that Jesus and therefore the church always makes this radical choice in favor of the weakest and in our society. So um, that theme of it's not possible to separate our love and worship of our Creator and care for the poor, they're inseparable. So as Kevin mentioned, they're going back to the heart of the message and to the heart of Jesus. And there's a lovely tour kind of through the earliest Christian communities and Catholic social teaching. And it's extremely rich. And towards the end of the document, I think it's the second to last chapter, there's this fantastic summary, almost a history of modern Catholic social teaching from Rerum Novarum, which is Pope Leo the 13th, to today. So really encourage people to embrace that little tour of Catholic social teaching. And in there's a phrase in that second to last chapter where he says, we must denounce the dictatorship of an economy that kills. So this kind of leads into the second point I wanted to make this evening, that I think to sum up the document would be to say that it's really urging us to address the structural causes of poverty. And yes, like our charitable works are important, but putting a band-aid on things is just not going to cut it. We have to get to the heart of the injustice that's present in society. And I suppose for us in Trocher, that's what we try to do on a daily basis. Our tagline is working for a just world. And so yes, we're responding daily to the humanitarian crises of our world and firefighting, pardon the pun, in many cases, working in situations on the ground like in Gaza and South Sudan, and responding to climate emergencies and climate disasters around the world. But at the heart of much of our work is um, trying to address the root causes of poverty and injustice. And just to give a few examples from our work, we have our policy and campaigns teams who are uh, always trying to campaign our governments on matters of policy that are causing injustice in other parts of the world. So, for example, in this past week, some of our policy team have been in Geneva at the UN, campaigning on the Business and Human Rights Bill which is dealing with injustices along production lines and corporations, especially in places like Honduras and Guatemala, that are causing huge suffering for people in communities there in terms of land rights, resource rights, environmental rights, and human rights defenders and so on. So trying to strengthen policies and laws in this part of the world that are directly affecting people in grassroots communities in our partner countries where we work. Um, can think of other campaigns we're involved in at the moment, like the Occupied Territories Bill, trying to have a bill passed in the Irish, in the Dáil, in the Irish Parliament, that would cease trade with Israel due to the ongoing genocide in Palestine, Gaza. So I suppose these are the ways that we are trying to address the structural causes of injustice in our world. And it's just good to see that drawn out in this particular encyclical, as well as like the key values and principles of Catholic social teaching. Like there's a quote in the document, if I just find it here now, which says, God has a special place in his heart for those who are discriminated against and oppressed, and he asks us, his church, to make a decisive and radical choice in favor of the weakest. And this is without discrimination towards other groups, but it's meant to emphasize God's actions moved by compassion towards the poverty and weakness of all humanity. So there's just fantastic reminders in the documents around the preferential option for the poor, the values that inspire our work in Troicres, which are grounded in Catholic social teaching, the social teaching of the Church. I will make a little criticism. I'm a little bit astounded that the environmental crisis gets, I think, one mention in the entire document and a couple of footnotes. Um, and I suppose I'm quite surprised at that, because I don't think you can talk about poverty in our world today without talking about climate injustice and the ecological crisis in the wider sense. Um, there are hints at it in various places, talking about resource rights, access to food, water, how women are on the front lines of many injustices in our world, but to explicitly name the ecological crisis as a driver of poverty in our world today just didn't come out for me in the document at all, apart from paragraph 96. He says we cannot fail to consider the effect on people's lives of environmental deterioration. Um, but within the wider documents, it's barely referenced. So I was just a little surprised about that, and be curious to hear other people's thoughts on it, especially since some of us are just back from Raising Hope in the 10th anniversary conference, which was held in Rome. And Pope Leo spoke so strongly at that conference about the climate crisis and said, we cannot be indifferent, and there's no room for resignation where the climate crisis is concerned. And he really put a challenge to everyone gathered there about, what will our answer be when we're asked by God, how did we care for our sisters and brothers and for God's creation? So clearly linking the two. I mean, he speaks about St. Francis of Assisi in this document in a long list of saints and early Christian communities. But he talks about St. Francis of Assisi without mentioning nature or ecology. So I'm just curious about that, and perhaps it's a sign that whenever this was written, maybe Pope Leo is on a journey himself, and or maybe he feels what has been said in Laudato Si is out there, and referencing it in the footnotes is enough. So just curious about that as well. Just to maybe finish up, my time is up, but there was an analogy which I loved at Raising Hope by an excellent input from a guy called Kumi Nedu, who you may be familiar with. He's the president of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and this is a treaty that we're campaigning on as well, to try and remove the structural injustice related to the ecological crisis, which is the fossil fuel industry. But Kumi was saying in his presentation, we need to stop mopping up the kitchen and turn off the tap when it comes to the climate crisis. So I think you could, maybe sum up a lot of what Pope Leo is saying in this document around, yes, we need charity and we need to respond in terms of humanitarian aid and so on when it's called for. But we need to turn the tap off on injustice, and that's dealing with the root causes. And I think in this document, Pope Leo is really calling us back to that, to work for a just world. So I'll leave there. Thanks.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you. You've given us loads to think about there and some great images. A reminder, if you have any questions for our speakers tonight, please do put them in the chat. We don't have any in the chat yet, and the harder they are, the better. Make them work. And Peter, I don't think Peter McVery needs any introduction, but Peter's a long-time team member here at the Jesuit Centre for Faith and Justice and housing and a campaigner for housing and against poverty. So Peter, how has Dilexti Te resonated with you?
I think it's a wonderful document. Much has already been said that I would have to repeat if I were to give an account of it. It follows very much on Pope Francis. Pope Francis many times said that we must not just evangelize the poor, we must be evangelized by the poor. And I think this document emphasizes that again and again and again. Leo says the poor are not only objects of our compassion, but they're teachers of the gospel. And so again and again and again, he highlights the fact that we encounter Jesus in our contact with the poor, that the poor reveal the presence of God to us. So he constantly reiterates that if we ignore the poor, we are ignoring God. If we reject the poor, we're rejecting God. That God is present in the poor, and God is present to us in our contact with the poor. The other thing that he emphasizes are structures. He says that for the Christian religion cannot be limited to the private sphere. There are structures in our societies and in our world which are creating poverty, maintaining poverty and marginalization. And those structures, which he calls structures of sin, have got to be challenged by the church and by society in general. It says welfare projects which meet certain urgent needs should be considered merely provisional responses. And he calls on our politicians to address the deeper issues, the structural issues, which are causing and maintaining poverty. He also, and we can see that in Ireland, in the housing, for example. Housing is, our housing crisis is largely caused by people using housing as a means of making money. It's an investment opportunity from which they can extort rent, or they can hold on to the house for a while and then sell it at a profit. And so those powerful interests are effectively creating a housing problem for those who are poor. Without using the word solidarity, Leo, in fact, asks us to move from compassion to solidarity. That we in Ireland, we're very good at compassion. We're not very good at solidarity. Solidarity is, Leo says, no Christian can regard the poor simply as a social problem. They are part of our family. They are one of us. And that is a definition almost of solidarity. So he emphasizes very much the structural causes. He also focuses on the mindset. If we want to change government policy, we have to change mindsets, first of all. And Leo focuses in on mindsets. He talks about those structures of sin, those structural of sin, is frequently part of a dominant mindset that considers normal or reasonable what is merely selfishness or indifference. So he challenges us, and he has a lovely sentence which I love in number 11. It says, in fact, the illusion of happiness derived from a comfortable life pushes many people towards a vision of life centered on the accumulation of wealth and social success at all costs, even at the expense of others, and by taking advantage of unjust social ideals and political economic systems that favor the strongest. I think that's a very powerful sentence. You can apply it to many of the issues in Irish society. You could apply it to, as I say, to the housing. You could apply it to the education system. You could apply it to the health system. We have to change mindsets if we are going to change. So he's calling for us as a church to make a decisive, radical choice in favor of the weakest. And that's a very strong statement, and it's a very powerful statement and a very challenging statement to us. So the problem of the poor leads to the very heart of our faith. So it's a question of identification of our contact with Jesus, with our contact with the poor. It's a focus on structural causes, and we cannot live a private Christian life. We have got to be involved in challenging the structural causes which lead to poverty, and we have to challenge our mindsets and other people's mindsets in order to bring about change. So I'll leave it there and leave some time for questions.
Thank you, Peter. And that was wonderful. We do have a couple of questions coming in. So it strikes me that this document may be timely in addressing the current movement of some Catholics towards the prosperity gospel and its belief that God rewards the truest and most faithful with material wealth. So would anybody like to take that on? Do you think is that a current in the church at the moment? Do Catholics believe that God reward them with wealth, and is that what Pope Leo is responding to? Anybody like to take that up?
I don't think it's a problem, particularly in Ireland. I don't think very many people would believe that. But we can be very comfortable in our lives. We can be very comfortable in our faith, a faith that doesn't challenge us particularly. I think that's a bigger problem, just to be comfortable in the in what we are now what we now consider to be our faith. I think we have to be challenged to go beyond that private understanding of faith to that social understanding of that.
And of course, the flip side of the prosperity gospel of that is if somebody is poor, well, then they are being punished by God in some way, or that's their just reward. So, Pope Leo is clearly speaking against that and saying, no, the poor are revealing God. It's not that they are punished. Thanks for that question. And a question here from Noel for Kevin. Kevin Hargaden's contributions seem to qualify the role of actions on social policy in this document. Could Kevin clarify what he is saying in regard to this?
Thanks, Noel. Great question. I read this kind of, there's a very thin thread, but because we're a social policy center, we're very interested in this thread that the Pope laces through the document, which basically says that whatever we're doing in terms of justice, it has to go beyond simply being technocratically expert on the causes of poverty. So I absolutely affirm what Jane said in terms of the document, and Peter both emphasized how the document overwhelmingly is concerned with structural sin and with achieving justice that goes at the root cause of things and doesn't seek to kind of do band-aid compassion activity. But at the same time, in paragraph 81, there's this discussion of what's called social movements, what the popes have called social movements, which are civil society groups. And Pope Leo and then Pope Francis before him worried that they're weakening. And he says that if we didn't have these groups, then all that we'd have is this idea of social policy being a policy for the poor. Whereas the Catholic Church is pressed into saying social policy with the poor and of the poor. So it's not that he's suggesting that we shouldn't be involved in questions of structural justice and the details of policy, but he's pressing us to really um, do our work, not just paternalistically sitting in the position of expertise, but to be down amongst the people who are suffering this marginalization, this oppression, and the difficulties that are caused, the suffering that's caused by poverty. I hope that makes sense, Noel. But it's just he's warning us against, in Laudato Si, Francis talks about the technocratic paradigm, and I think that Leo is very clearly communicating to us that it isn't sufficient for us to have all of the data. We actually have to know people's names, and we have to be familiar with the people who we're representing for and advocating for. I don't know if Jane or Peter want to speak more to that, because both of you in different ways are much more involved in it than I am.
Okay, we're just over time now, and I want to respect the time limit that we set in the webinar tonight, and just to give a mention as well to Keith's question, that prison was central to Francis's pontificate and thinking, and he's asking, does Dilexi Te give a sense that this will continue with Leo? I'll leave that question with you. All of you who are tuning in, keep the prisoner and those who are incarcerated in your thoughts when you're reading through the document yourselves. Thank you to all of you for tuning in this evening. I just want to leave you with some future events that JCFJ will be hosting. So thanks, Cherise, for that next slide. So please keep an eye out please first of all subscribe for updates on our website, jcfj.ie, working notes, subscribe. And then on November 5th, we will be launching our piece of research we've done here at the centre called Faith in the North East Inner City, and that's focusing on the work that faith-based communities and worshipping communities do in helping newcomers to integrate here in Dublin. So that's a really interesting piece of research. And also on November the 11th, there will be an information webinar about the Theology and Social Justice MPhil program in Trinity College that Kevin and others here in the centre are teaching on, just bringing theology and social justice sciences together. And that is surely to enliven the life of the church here in Ireland, and to revivify us with a spirit of compassion and solidarity, as Peter mentioned. So thank you so much for tuning in this evening and for joining us. Please do subscribe and keep in touch with JCFJ. Good night and God bless.
Thanks.